All right, so I've just pressed the record button so we can get started. Thanks for your student numbers and welcome along to today's writing circle. All right, so I think everybody can hear me okay and everyone's muted, which is great. It just helps with the background noise. You can turn your cameras off too if you want to. If you want to ask any questions, just use the chat tool. We're all sort of monitoring it. We'll try to pause. If not, we do have a Q&A session at the end today. So hopefully we'll be running well on time and we'll have plenty of time for that. All right, so as always, just to start, we would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. Thank you for your student numbers, that's great. All right, it's 9:31, let's get started. So we're going to begin by getting you to think and write a couple of sentences down. So it doesn't matter if you don't have a post-it note, but if you do, this will be a good exercise for you to be concise. Let's have a look. Can you write your research problem or topic, your research aims, and who will benefit from the research findings? Can you write those in a couple of sentences on a post-it note? Have a go if you can right now. It's a bit like your elevator pitch, and it's really important that you can tell people about these main points of your research. Sometimes it's a bit hard, isn't it, when someone says, oh, what are you studying? There's a bit of a sigh and, oh, well, it's complicated, but you need to be able to do this. So if you can try this out, that'll be a good start to the morning. Get your brain working. So these are the types of things that would be straight up in your introduction. We'll have a look at that in a minute. Any kind of introduction, wouldn't matter whether it's your research proposal or your final thesis, or if you were writing a journal article as well. So give it a try. Just write 3 sentences even if you don't have the post-it note, and we'll check back in on how you went in a minute. All right, so writing circles, as usual, obviously the main aim is to help you improve your writing skills, building confidence in your writing. Confidence is a really big part for you guys to trust yourself that you're doing the right thing. So writing can help in that process. And also, of course, the opportunity to network with your peers. We're doing 2 breakouts today, so be ready for those. And of course, your evaluative judgment and self-regulation. So remember, the evaluative judgment is knowing about the quality of your work and how you can improve. And then the self-regulation is putting into process those things that you need to do to improve. So of course, coming to these writing circles and all of our group events is a really way to help build those skills as well. Goals for today, the purposes of your introduction and conclusion. So as always in all of our writing sessions, have a think where you're at in your journey, because, you know, no matter whether you're writing your proposal, your stage 2, your confirmation, your final, you will need to write an introduction, of course. And even if you're not up to your final thesis yet, the conclusion is still something you can start thinking about and jotting down a few points. So always think about how the things that we discuss apply exactly to you. There are important connections between your introduction and conclusion. That's why we talk about them at the same time. And we're going to look at some strategies to be clear and engaging in those chapters as well. All right, so yep, peer discussion. We're actually going to jump into that very shortly. Then we're going to come back. We're going to look at writing your introduction chapter. We're going to break out again to look at an exemplar, come back, talk about your conclusion chapters, and then we'll have time for the Q&A at the end. Now, with the exemplars, I really want you to remember what the purpose of those are. And there's no right or wrong. The point is to be able to notice. This is a skill, and so when you're reading through the exemplar, there's a few questions to prompt, and also to look at the type of language, the transition signals, the wording, the sentence structures, and just how it flows. And I'm not saying that that the exemplars that we always give you are absolutely perfect, because nothing's ever perfect, but they certainly are something that you can use as a model as such. And, you know, part of noticing and reading exemplars as well is saying, I don't really like the way that was written. I prefer to write in this way, and that's fine as well. Okay, so I really, when you're looking at those exemplars, just discuss, just see what you notice and practice those skills of looking at writing and being able to pull it apart and think, okay, how has this engaged or not engaged me, and what strategies has the writer used? Okay, so were you able to write those core elements on your post-it note? I hope that you tried, because you're going to practice your 1-minute elevator pitch in the breakout room discussions right now. Now, don't forget, you've got to accept the breakout room pop-up in the middle of the screen. You're going to introduce yourself. See if you can say those sentences that you just wrote down. And there's a couple of discussion questions there. What challenges have you come across when writing your introduction chapter, and how you've dealt with those challenges? So we're just going to spend 15 minutes. It's just a quick one. Don't forget that the pop-up looks like this, and you're going to press join. Okay, so now we have to check my breakout room skills. Okay, so it is if you haven't been in a breakout room, it is a weird feeling sometimes, because you get pushed into this room. But okay, so we've got 50. All right, so off you go. I'll pop in and see you guys, but have fun, and I'll see you back in a minute. Okay, just can hear some microphones there if you wouldn't mind. Oh, yeah, perfect. All right, so let's keep going. So hopefully some of the challenges that you were talking about, if that's what you discussed in your breakout, we might talk about those today to help you to deal with those. Okay, yep, so we've done that. All right, writing your introduction chapter. So what's the purpose of your introduction chapter? So you... Ooh, microphones off, please. If everyone can turn their microphones off, it would be fantastic. Okay, so you do need to give the reader a broad overview of basically everything that is going to be in the whole thesis. So the topic, the background, what the scope, your research aims. You might put your research questions in. I would suggest yes, do. There's still some people with their microphones on. If you wouldn't mind turning them off, that would be really good. Oh, good. Okay, thank you. Okay, research questions. Yes, I would recommend that you put them in your introduction chapter. If your supervisors have a different idea, then that's fine. Go ahead with what they say. And I'd also mention something about your research design as well in your introduction. It only needs to be a sentence or two. Okay, even if you just mention it's a qualitative study and just really briefly, or mixed, or whatever, experimental, whatever it is, you really need to give the introduction a broad overview. It's important to say where your research fits in the field of study. You have to mention some gaps and the significance and the contributions and any important concepts. So perhaps, I know I was speaking with a few other people that were saying that that's one of the challenges, is that repetition, but you have to do that in the thesis. You need to plant the seed at the beginning and say, these are all the important parts of my study, and then you expand on those through the other chapters. So you need to make a good initial impression. It's your first chance to engage the reader, assuming that's where they start reading, but we can make that assumption. And you need to start convincing them that they should be reading on, and what you're demonstrating to the reader. And that is that your study is worthwhile. Remember, we've talked about that a lot, about the value of your research. So remember when we had the workshop a few weeks ago on engaging your reader, and we talked about examiners, and most examiners will begin just when they get the thesis, they'll say, okay, I'm excited, I can't wait to read this, and they start with a positive frame of mind. So we want to keep that, and we want to engage them from the start. So no matter, if you don't impress them at the beginning, it's going to be really hard to get that back. So convince the reader why the research is needed, and why should we care about the topic, and what are the potential implications. So the so what and for who. That really needs to be part of your introduction, and it also needs to be near the beginning as well. All right. So there's a lot of information to pack in at the start, and that's one of the challenges of the introduction. So how do we get started? Well, think about how many words or pages that you need. Like anything, that gives you a framework to start with. You can put some draft subheadings. Just start with dot points. If you're not sure yet, like we just said with your elevator pitch, you know, you've got a few dot points there. Pop those down to start with, and then you can flesh it all out as you start writing your drafts. You can set up a structure. We're going to have a look at a potential structure that you could use, but you do need to be flexible and willing to change as you go. And as always, just start writing your drafts and seeking feedback, you know. But as I said, it's really important in those first few paragraphs to get that essential information in about your aims and the value of your research. So as we said, it's always about the reader. This is your opportunity to hook them in from those first couple of paragraphs. You want them reading and saying, interesting, okay, yep, I can see where this is going. So also don't forget, the reader doesn't know you, they don't know what's in your head. You need to get it all out, and you need to impress from the beginning. Don't make them wait. Okay, that's one of the frustrating things to when you're reading an introduction chapter, is if there's lots of things saying, I'm not sure where this is going. You want it the opposite, for the reader to say, okay, this sounds really interesting. I'm really looking forward to continuing on. Remember as well that examiners read a lot of theses, okay? They read a lot of them. They read good ones, they read bad ones. Make yours a good one so that they're happy and engaged and want to keep reading. So here's an example of what you might do in an introduction chapter. This is not set in stone. So if this doesn't apply exactly perhaps to your field of study, that's okay. But it just can give you a starting point. Now, I want you to notice how it goes from broad to narrow. Now, again, this is not set in stone, okay? This is just a way to get you started with some subheadings. But it makes sense, doesn't it, to introduce the topic and the problem and the background and those sorts of things at the beginning. Then you're going to narrow down and say, okay, well, what are the gaps? What are the research questions? How far am I going? What's the scope? And then at the end of the introduction is where you would say, okay, this is the structure of the thesis that you can expect, or your confirmation document, or your research proposal, whichever it might be. So yes, going from broad to narrow, but it's not strict. There's a bit of room for however you think makes sense for your field of study and for your topic as well. So there is a template that QUT has. It's on HiQ, you can see there. It's on your candidature page. Okay, then you go to your thesis and writing a thesis. The link's there. I think Murray's going to pop it into the chat when he has a second. Sorry. So yes, sorry. So you can go onto HiQ, and the template. So when you come down, you'll see it's formatting your thesis. There's a couple of templates if you're doing unnumbered or numbered. That's going to depend on your field of study, as always. So there's some good information there that might just help you to get started. Okay. All right. Some things to consider. I know that I said you've got to define all your important concepts in your introduction, and this is still the case even if you have a glossary of terms, but I would advise that you include that glossary of terms as well. And that usually goes after the list of tables and your list of figures. But even if you have that, you still need to define the concepts in your introduction, and then in your literature review would be when you would expand even further. Tense. So what tense should your introduction chapter be in? So again, it depends where you're at. If you're in your research proposal or your confirmation document or stage 2, you're going to be in a little bit of future tense when you're talking about your exact study, okay? But you can refer the reader to specific sections in later chapters. So in your introduction, if you want to start the thread of something that's really important, you can mention it and then say it's discussed further in another section. So have a look at the tense there. This issue is discussed further. Now, the reason why it's in present tense is because the reader is reading now. Don't say this issue will be discussed, okay? All right. So some common mistakes: no introductory paragraph to lead the reader in. You'll be surprised how often I see this where the first sentence in an introduction chapter of any kind of thesis or a confirmation or proposal says, the aims of this research are. Okay. So can you see how that doesn't lead the reader in, does it? You need to start a little bit broader than that, and then you can talk about the aims. And I'm not saying you can't say the aims in the first paragraph, you can, but that should not be the first sentence. It's too much for the reader. We need a little bit of background first. So that's the second point there, rushing in with information that's not fully explained. It's really hard for the reader, and you're not making it hard for the reader. We need to make it easy for the reader. Okay. Not enough explanation. So there's your balance, isn't it? Okay, you need to explain enough to get the reader understanding where you're going, but you don't have endless amount of words in your introduction. So that is a challenge. And one way around that is you can refer forward if you need to, mention plant the seed, and then you can refer forward. But finding that balance can be hard, especially in your research proposals where you are really restricted with your number of words. So a lot of drafting, a lot of thinking, a lot of moving around and restructuring while you figure out that good balance. Try not to give really technical concepts without defining them as well. That's really important. Again, we don't want the reader saying, yes, okay, but I don't really know what this exactly means. You don't want that. They need to understand what it means. Another thing that I see a lot is an introduction chapter that says I'm going to do this, this, and something else, and then you get to the conclusion or even through the other chapters and it hasn't done those things. Okay, sounds like, oh, who would do that? Well, it does happen because you have so much going on. This is a really big undertaking, as we all know. Okay, so your introduction and conclusion are upside down mirrors. This is why we're putting them together in the one themed writing circle. So your introduction, remember we said it's going from broad to narrow, and then your conclusion will be the opposite. It'll be going from narrow to broad, more or less. This is not set in stone, but you can see how they would mirror each other. What's in the introduction should also be concluded in the conclusion. Okay, remember you're telling your research story. It has a beginning and it has an end, and they should match. All right, we'll talk about that more in a minute. Also, don't forget to go back to your introduction chapter when you are writing up your final thesis. Another thing that I see a lot is a thesis that's being ready to submit and the introduction is still in future tense. Okay, that's no good. It shouldn't be in future tense. And when you're writing up, it should be in present tense. So yes, make sure you change the tense. And also don't forget, something might come up that you weren't expecting. So that'll need to be added into your introduction. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about conclusions a little bit later. But that's something to really think about with your subheadings and with your drafting, that the introduction and conclusion need to match to some extent. All right, so what we're going to do now is pop back into our breakout rooms. You will be with different people. Obviously, I can't pop you in the same ones. And we're going to look at an exemplar which was sent to you. Hopefully everyone got it in the email yesterday afternoon. So when you're in there, one person is going to share their screen. And as I said before with the exemplar, there's no right or wrong with what you're discussing, okay? Just pull it apart, look at the wording, look at how it's structured, look at whether the research aims are there and if the important information is explained. It's not necessarily a perfect introduction, but there should be a few things that you can see there with that follow the things that we've just talked about for your introduction chapter. Okay, so there's the exemplar there. So once you get in there, I also, in the email yesterday, I explained about how you can share your screen. So Murray might be able to pop that into the chat as well. Worst case scenario, if you have trouble with the technology and you can't share your screen and you can't do the annotating like we've done before, that's okay, because you've all got the exemplar there, so you can still discuss it. The sentences are numbered. So hopefully you can still have a good session, but do try to share the screen that was in the instructions that I sent out. All right, so I'm going to pop you into your groups. All right, so we'll see you back here shortly. Okay, so can you see the screen okay? I think the answer is yes. So now that we've looked at the introduction chapter, let's have a look at writing your conclusion. Now, it doesn't matter if you're not quite up to that. As I said before, even if you're doing a research proposal or your confirmation or stage 2 or whatever it is, you can start thinking about your potential conclusions and implications and contribution. And because they're a mirror, your introduction and your conclusion, that's something you can start thinking about, you know, even just some subheadings, some dot points, they might change, but that's okay. Alrighty, so what's the purpose of your conclusion chapter? It's the last thing the examiner will read, okay? So we want to really go out with a bang and make them really happy and feel like, wow, that was really worth reading and this is a valuable study. Something to put a thought in your mind as well, how do we know that the examiner won't read your conclusion chapter first? That's something else to think about as well. And that's why it's really important that you repeat or have that mirror situation going on with your introduction and conclusion, because they may look at the two in together. You never know. So also your conclusion, you're demonstrating that you're an expert in your field, which you are. Make sure you actually answer your research questions in an explicit way. You could very well have the words that say, in response to research question 1, which asked, and say what you asked, and then give the answer. It could be as simple as that. If you have hypotheses, you need to say whether they were confirmed or whether they were null. And also make it very clear about who the findings are significant and for and why. You know, you've poured your heart and your soul into this research. That's taken years of your life, countless hours. You've sacrificed a lot. So, you know, you want to really say, ta-da, look at how insightful my research has been. You want to shout it from the rooftops and, you know, really finish in a strong way. In our engaging your reader, remember I said that you need to be punchy, you know, and that's really important for your conclusion chapter. So don't forget though, anything you claim or you state in your conclusion chapter, there has to be evidence for it, and that's going to be explained in your results and discussions chapter. You have to be really careful of that to make sure you can back up everything that you're going to talk about in your conclusion. So as the writer, you are responding, as we said, to your research questions or your hypotheses. You're giving your implications and recommendations. We'll look at the difference between those in a second. Also, come back to what you said in the introduction about, okay, there's a research field that is saying these things about this topic. Bring it back. You know, have you found something that confirms what other researchers have said? That's okay, confirming what other researchers in your field have said. There will also be something new that hasn't been studied before. Remember, it doesn't matter if it's only small. But, you know, bring it back to what it means for your research field as well as what it means for all your stakeholders as well, and how you've contributed to current knowledge. Remember that could be theoretical, practical, methodological. It could be all three. Depends. All right. Sometimes your conclusion chapter will include your research limitations. We're going to look at that in a minute as well. And also it would generally have future research that's required that will continue on from your good work. So a lot of things happening in your conclusion chapter. That's why you can sort of start, you know, writing a few things down and drafting that at this point. It doesn't matter if it changes after you've actually done all the research. At least you've made a start. Just make sure all your microphones are off as well, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, how do we get started? It's exactly the same as all of your other chapters. Just start, don't wait. You've got good thoughts, write them down, figure out how many words or pages, set up some subheadings. It doesn't matter if they change, at least you've made a start. You can do that today. You can set up a conclusion chapter, the first version, write a few dot points, set up that structure. Yes, it's going to change, but that's all right. You know, you don't necessarily have to wait to the very, very end to start your conclusion chapter. And actually, I probably wouldn't. All right, you want to start writing it, seek a bit of feedback as well. So remember, we had the upside down triangle for your introduction. This time we've got the up the right way triangle, where we're going from narrow, where you're saying, okay, this study did something and this is what it found, then how you contribute to the research field and your implications, and then you'd expand out at the bottom to then how these recommendations could be put in place, potentially your limitations, and then your suggestions for future research. So see, we're going from narrow to broad this time, which is the opposite of your introduction. As I said, these are not set in stone. Yours might be slightly different. All right, but at least it gives you somewhere to start anyway. So implications and recommendations, what's the difference? So the implications are the general consequence. So if we were doing research into best practice for online teaching, we could say the research results provide guidance for online teaching best practice. What do you notice about the tense? In present tense, because if you say provided, it means they don't provide that guidance anymore, which is not right, is it? Your study's happening now, and you want those implications to move forward. So then the recommendations are then the specific actions that should be taken based on the implications. You need to be really specific with these. It is recommended that Education Queensland incorporate these best practices as part of teacher personal development and training. You couldn't leave it at that, okay? You would then say, well, how exactly? You know, what part of their training, and who would want to need to have this training, and how would that training look like? So don't be vague. Really, you know, give something that those stakeholders that are having these implications affecting them, give them something where they can see, okay, here's a bit of a step-by-step guide. Remember, you're an expert in this topic. Okay, you're allowed to recommend that the government should do something, or that, you know, whoever your stakeholders are, recommend that they should take specific steps based on what you found from your study. You need to be really clear about the contribution of that study to your field. And, you know, that's where these implications and recommendations, where you really get down to the finer details of exactly what your research means and the value of it. So a few things to think about. Again, your tense, okay. The participants reported A and B, all right, they reported it in the past, didn't they? Because you've already done the research, okay? This suggests X and Y because it's suggesting now. Does that make sense? I hope yes. So when you could say something like, the experiment revealed these specific things about something to do with engineering or science or whatever it might be, but you did the experiment in the past. Okay, so therefore you have to talk about it in the past tense. But the meaning of those results, you're going to put into present tense. So I think a really important part of your conclusion as well is be confident. Don't undersell. Okay, you've worked super hard on this. You've found some great things. So as we said, shout it from the rooftops. You also can't promise the world. Okay, so if we did that research into online teaching, we can't in our conclusion say, okay, well, this means if we have another pandemic or another lockdown that all the students and the teachers will learn everything and get 100% in their exams. Okay, you can't say that obviously, but what you can say is it's going to make it easier for teachers to, and then ultimately that's going to help the students. So you need to find that balance, be confident, but also you can't promise it. Everything's going to be brilliant from now on. Limitations, don't stress about adding those in. We'll talk about that again in a second. All studies have them, okay? Don't leave any loose ends. You're done. Yes, there's further research needed, but you're going to talk about that. This study is finished, okay? Yes, hopefully you're going to be the one. Yes, conclusion should refer back to specific. Well, actually, maybe not back to specific sections as such, because it should have all been clear. It's up to you whether to say in a conclusion you can refer back to the discussion. I wouldn't say don't do it, but hopefully it's all been very clear anyway, and your conclusion is just wrapping it all together. But yeah, you know, if you think that that makes sense to refer them back, then you can do that. Right, common mistakes. Again, see these things all the time. No introductory paragraph at the start. Remember what I said, maybe your examiner is going to read the conclusion first, okay? So what we have to do is start the conclusion with saying, what were you investigating? Why were you investigating it? And how? All right, it can be 2 sentences, rightio, and then you can start to say what the findings are. So I have seen a thesis with a 2 or 3 page conclusion, not long enough for a PhD. Not clearly answering the research questions or hypotheses, super important that you do that in an explicit way. So maybe that answers the question about referring back. You may not need to do that if you repeat the research questions, or, you know, repeat the important results and then come through with the implications and the recommendations. Don't be vague. As we said, you know, really spell out the steps that should be taken to implement your recommendations based on what you found. I mean, remember, you're solving a problem, okay? So there's a problem. This is what I found as a way to help to solve it. In order to do this, these steps need to be taken. That will be part of your conclusion. Spell out those steps, why and the who. This is not just a summary. You're bringing it all together. Okay, you know, the reader should be able to finish your conclusion and say, okay, that was a complete study from beginning to end. I can see how they found these results, and I can see why the results are important and how we can implement them. That's your aim. Few more common mistakes. Being too apologetic. Only yielded 1 main result. You would not say that. You would say there was a significant finding that's going to make life easier for whoever the stakeholders are. Sometimes conclusions are left to the very end and they're rushed. Okay, we don't want that. We want it. We're going to start today, aren't we? Version 1, conclusion chapter. Then we've got the other end where there's these grand claims with no evidence to support. The examiner will pick that up, all right? So we can't do that. In the conclusion, you really would not have too many citations, okay? Unless there's someone seminal, unless, you know, there's someone you've been using to underpin and it's really important to include them. Refer to the whole research field. You don't need to cite any of those sources now because you've done it all the way through the lit review, the discussion. There's a question here. Is the conclusion also the synthesis of preceding chapters? Yes, sort of. But yes, you're right. The synthesizing is done in the discussion of in the discussion, you're synthesizing your results with the previous literature. Okay, so, but you're using everything from those previous chapters to conclude. Weaving a golden thread, yes, you need to do that. You need to keep referring about your aims and using different using different words. I have too many aims and they should all be in the one section. How do I weave a golden thread? Well, if you have too many aims, then you've got to pull back and not have that many aims in the beginning, okay? And the golden thread is you just keep on mentioning and reminding the reader, all right? That's going to be all the way through, all right? Yes, there's repetition. There has to be. That's your golden thread. is that repetition. But you need to find that nice balance by rewording a little bit, yes, using some synonyms. Repetition is impossible to avoid and you should be using it, but you have to balance, okay? And that's what's hard. This is hard. Writing a thesis is hard. Doing research is hard. Writing about that research is. And this is why we have all this time to do it. And, you know, we have to write all of the drafts that we do and get the feedback. The difference between the discussion and the conclusion would be in the discussion, you're not putting those final implications and recommendations, okay? You plant the seed for those, yes, okay? And then you expand on it in the conclusion. Again, it's a juggle, it's a balance, okay? And that's about your golden thread, isn't it? My advice, if you're finding it hard to get your head around these ideas about the thread that goes all the way through, is read a thesis from your field, okay? Now, I'm not saying every thesis you see will be brilliantly written, but you should be able to pull a few things out that you think, okay, that makes sense. I can see what they've done, okay? All right, we're nearly done. Some useful phrases. This is for your conclusion. This study has shown, revealed, present perfect tense, right? Could you say this study shows? Absolutely, okay? Don't say showed, this study showed or revealed. Don't be in simple past, okay? Because that means it's finished and it doesn't show that anymore. It's that you're still relevant, your research is still relevant, okay? So present perfect or present. And then I've not done that in that 3 significant results emerged, but see how we're talking here about the results emerged. Results are about the exact thing that came from your data analysis. Okay, so that could be a reason for being in past there, but probably better to say 3 significant results have emerged, okay? Significant implications, the results suggest, depends how hard you want to go. Could you say the results of this study confirm? Yep, you could. And then when you're talking about future research, you're going to say it's needed to determine these specific things. Remember our mirror. Your conclusion chapter should not have anything that wasn't mentioned in the introduction, even if it's just briefly mentioned in 1 sentence. It has to be there. There's that full connection. They are mirrors of each other. So you need to go back and adjust the introduction to make sure that if there's any concepts that you included in the beginning when you're doing your proposal, if they didn't eventuate, you can take them out, if that makes sense to do that. If there's anything new that came up, you need to put that in. It's so important to go back and re-look at your introduction, and it will change quite a bit, I promise. Make sure that you've answered the research questions, and make sure that, remember, in your introduction, you've posed a research problem. So your conclusion, remember, we're coming full circle, it has to then solve as such the research problem, or help to gain more insight into the ways we can solve it. So I can't stress that enough about that connection between your introduction and your conclusion. Just so that we had a bit of a final wrap up, this is an example conclusion paragraph. So from the exemplar, so the introduction was the exemplar, this is part of the conclusion for the same study. So what do we notice? We notice the tense. The research results indicate, okay, that this support is necessary. So this was part of the initial problem, wasn't it? That the students needed support. The study provides evidence. That's a good word. Use the word evidence because you've collected evidence. So it was about the teachers, what sort of teaching strategies. So the evidence is that there's pedagogically sound teaching strategies that can do these things, and therefore the support is appropriate. Talks about the nature of the setting for the one-to-one and the learning environment. I'm going fast because I want to have time for our Q&A. So the slides are up on Blackboard. You can have another look. The combination of diagnosing student needs, adjusting teaching strategy, so going in a bit more detail about why the learning environment is good, and see that key thing about confidence building. That was one of the research questions, and it was one of the things that was discussed as part of the problem. The research confirms, so strong wording. What tense are we in? We're still in present tense. And it plays an important role. And then part of the issue was, well, this kind of teaching is expensive. Okay, well, but we're getting these good outcomes. So we need, and these benefits, economic and cultural benefits, which were part of the context in the background, wasn't it in the introduction. So although the issue of cost institutions need to consider, we want to have best teaching practices and approaches to support students. So see how we've come full circle. Now, obviously, this is just one paragraph, but what I want you to notice is the language is strong. It is vital, okay? The research confirms, and notice the tense, and using similar wording that was used in the introduction, so similar concepts, sorry. All right, just quickly, let's look at limitations, because this is something that's often a little bit difficult. Your limitations are usually to do with your research methods, okay? Every research method and data collection tool has advantages and disadvantages, which you will have highlighted in your methods chapter. So sometimes people put their limitations in their methods chapter instead, or as well as the conclusion. Talk to your supervisors, whatever's in your field of study, about how important it is to have this in the conclusion. Most of the time it does go in the conclusion, and it's quite brief, and mentioned also in your methods, okay? If you have got limitations due to your research methods or your data collection tools, then say how they were minimized, So one way that researchers at the moment minimize the qualitative and quantitative disadvantages is to do mixed methods, right? So you want to do quantitative because you want to measure and have those, that specific data that is concrete, but sometimes the qualitative can help to make a more understanding of the quantitative because you get more detail and richer data. Okay, so what would be the disadvantages of a survey? Well, how do we know that the participants have filled it out seriously? What if they've misunderstood some of the questions? So it's things like that the limitations might be around. And also, a limitation might be that you had a small sample. So therefore, we need further research. So you can link your limitations to the further research as well. And just have a quick look here. This is an example. This is from your example that you looked at. Several limitations. It was carried out with a relatively small sample from one university and one semester. So it's just a little snapshot, which a lot of the time our research is, because we are one person, right? With not much time and not much money. And that's okay. Don't stress about that as a limitation. They are genuine limitations. The study focused on the perspectives of teachers. So who else is in that learning environment? It's students. But remember, that was a gap. Okay, but still we want to know more from students because they're part of the dialogue. And then we had time and word limit constraints. And so everything that came up in the data analysis, and this will probably happen to you, you can't include it all in the research findings. So that's just an example. But as I said, check with your supervisor about limitations, whether I would say you would have to put it in, but perhaps not in the conclusion. Maybe it'll be in the methods chapter. All right, so just before we go into the Q&A, so remember the introduction, start the story, make a good impression, conclusion, finish the story, clear and convincing evidence-based argument, and a final good impression. They're mirrors of each other, okay? Super important to remember that connection. And be confident. You've got a contribution to make, even if it's small. That's okay. That's all you need. That small contribution could change somebody's life or, bring about some really important change. Just some quick tips that we always talk about. Word limits for a thesis, yes, it'll be in that link that we gave you earlier on HiQ, your candidature. Proofread, print and read aloud. Notice when you read, that's the whole point of our exemplars. We've got lots of resources on our GRE+D Blackboard page. If you are struggling, if you need help, ask for it. There's lots of help out there. Number one is your supervisors. Seek lots of feedback and, you know, take care of yourself as well. It's, you know, you're not defined by your study. You're still a person, okay, with feelings. All right, so everything will be up on Blackboard. Don't forget our self-assessment tool. That's really a good way to assess your, self-assess your writing. What's coming up? We've got the Wellbeing Lounge on Monday, another writing circle in a couple of weeks, another lounge. And don't forget, if you're a new student, we've got our orientation on the 21st of July. You should have received an invitation for that. HiQ, Blackboard, your e-updates, everything's emailed to you. So you should know where to find all that, I hope, by now. The skills assessment tool, that's a really good one to see things that you might need to work on through your candidature. There's the HiQ pages. Okay, so I know we're a little bit late, which always does happen, but we still have a few minutes and I'm happy to stay a little bit longer. So if you want to turn on your mic or put your question in the chat and we can go through them. And I also wanted to pose a couple of questions to you guys. Why did you think the introduction chapter is challenging when you had your chat? What about the difference between an introduction and an abstract? And does anyone think that they should leave their introduction until the end? With the fact that we've got an introduction and conclusion that are mirrors, maybe that's a strategy. I'm not saying you should, I'm just posing it as a possible question. All right, we have got a few questions there in the chat. Let's have a look. Yes, the review read aloud function on Word really can help you when you're doing your proofreading. It's up on the home section of Word. You should be able to see it. If you Google, it's called Read Aloud. Thank you for everyone that's come. By the way, if you do have to go, that's fine. Where are the question? There's another. Where there are multiple research questions and the conclusion answers each one, is a good practice to make an overall concluding statement that ties the answers to all the research questions together. I would say yes. A concluding statement that ties the answers to the research questions together with the assumption that those questions are linked. Okay, if they're completely sort of different, you might need a couple of concluding sentences as such. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, and I think these questions that you guys are asking sheds light on the fact of why the introduction and the conclusion are really challenging. I think every chapter is challenging, but part of the problem with your introduction and your conclusion is they're generally the shortest chapters, but they're also super important and you have to include a whole lot of information. So in answer to that question, Ricky, I would say yes, if you can, definitely, because remember that overall concluding statement would be about how we're going to go and solve this research problem as such, because the questions would be informing that overall problem in the research field. So I hope that answers you there. So what is the difference between the abstract and the conclusion? Well, in your abstract, remember that's a summary of the whole thesis. So you pull something from your introduction, you pull something from what the research findings were, and in your abstract you have to say the conclusions. So that's sort of, the abstract is a snapshot of the whole thing, Whereas the introduction, you're not going to put your conclusions, but you are going to plant the seed of potential implications because they will link to the problem. So we have this problem, research problem, and the way to solve it is through this research design. And if we can solve this problem, it will benefit these particular stakeholders. So Marty has said, I plan to write my introduction at the end.
Can I add to that, Karen?
Ooh, yes, of course.
You
scared me.
I think the abstract, from the way that I've always thought of the abstract is that it's a bit of a sales pitch. In what are people actually going to want as the headlines for a piece of research?
Yeah.
And so in that way, I've always included some of the key results in the abstract, like certainly highlighted them a lot more in the abstract than you would in an introduction. I think the introduction and conclusion are much more balanced. You kind of cover everything equally. But for me, the abstract, and maybe it's slightly different in the thesis than a journal article. But for me, the abstract is something punchy that highlights the great work in a really short way. Whereas so it's not as balanced. It's taking some of the key parts that you think the reader is going to find the most interesting.
Yeah, you would definitely include the significant findings in the abstract. Yeah, and the abstract is, well, what do we do when we're reading a journal article? We read the abstract, right? And then we decide whether it's worth reading. Now, with your thesis, the examiner has to read it, but no one else has to. So potential other readers in your field are going to look at the abstract and say, oh, yeah, this is something that I think I should read. These findings look really good, and the conclusions as well. Thanks, Murray. That's good. Marty says, I plan to write my introduction at the end in tandem with writing the conclusion. Write them both more or less together. Yeah, look, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. At the very least, while you are writing your conclusion, you should have your introduction handy to be able to see if it's coming as a mirror. I know that, think of your stages, okay? The first year is your proposal. The second year, you're collecting and analysing the data. The third year, you're essentially writing up. Sort of. Obviously, it's slightly different. It doesn't exactly work totally like that. But, while you're doing your data collection and your analysis and you're writing those chapters up, come back to your introduction and just see if it still aligns, and looking at your conclusion. And you can start putting your dot points and writing up your conclusion as well at any stage. You don't have to wait. But yes, that is definitely a strategy to be writing them together. But don't forget as well, you might want to step back and have a bit of distance as well to be able to look and make sure that you have mixed it up a little bit, that you've used some different phrasing, because yes, they're a mirror, but they can't be sort of exactly the same as well. You've got to find that good balance. Yes, the abstract probably would not have any references. It's your own words. Yeah, sometimes an abstract may, but it would. But Nicole, you're right. If you have got any citations, there would be very few, and they would be seminal authors in your field. Can you write your conclusion as part of the discussion? Do you mean, can you write them at the same time? And I would say yes. Maybe you're meaning discussion and conclusion as a chapter. Yes, if you and your supervisor think that's the way to go. Sometimes I do see a thesis that has that. And also if you're an MPhil student, that could be another way. I know I did that in my dissertation for my master's. I put the discussion and conclusions together because you're restricted with your words a little bit more. So that's something you can think of for sure. But you would still have the discussion first and then have the conclusion. So in your discussion, you're planting the seed about what those final implications are going to be, okay? But you're not going to put those exactly in the discussion. I know it can be a bit confusing, with this overlap between the chapters, but it's like a story, remember, and we don't know where the reader's going to pick it up from. So every chapter needs to be a little bit of a standalone, where you've repeated, okay, the aims for the research are these, this is how the study was done, and these are the findings and the results. What are the difference between aims and objectives? I would say none. Objective is just a synonym of aims. Does everyone agree with that? Nobody's saying. Yeah, Legion, I would say it's not a silly question. It's not a silly question, but I would say they're the same thing. So perhaps you could mix it up and use the word objectives instead of aims, but I don't know. I worry about that because you don't want to confuse the reader. I know that the discussion is only to discuss your findings, but I struggle how to avoid writing your discussion. I don't think that's what you mean. So with the discussion, remember that what's the main point of that is you're bringing in the literature from the literature review, okay? So remember how we say the introduction and conclusion are mirrors, your discussion and your literature review are mirrors as well, okay? So and then your methods chapter is in the middle there. That's really important. This is how you've done the research. And then you've got perhaps a findings chapter or a results chapter where all you're doing is saying, okay, did some interviews, this is what the participants said, did some experiments, this is what the outcomes of those were. So then the discussion is bringing in the literature. Where does your findings fit with those? I hope that helped with that struggle there. Okay, we've been taught that aims are broader and objectives are the individual steps. Okay, fine. Yep, that sounds good. As long as you tell the reader that, that's perfectly fine. So maybe, Lijan, you can use that as a thought. Okay, so we've got this overall aim, and then to achieve those aims, there's these smaller objectives. So yeah, and also don't forget that as part of your data collection, you'll have a few different data collection tools, I would say. Usually you would need more than one. So you could say, well, the objective of this data collection tool or this part of the research design is to achieve this part of my aim or this research question. So that's another way you can work around it. So as long as you explain to the reader, I have this overall aim, and to achieve that aim, I have these smaller objectives, you could do that for sure. Yep, objective, how to get what you want, good. Both aims are the same. Yeah, look, that's it. It just depends. You know, some people will say they're the same, some people will say that they're slightly different, and that's perfectly fine. You know, you can, as long as you keep the reader in the loop and you explain to them what you mean by aim and what you mean by objective, happy days, you're fine. There's no drama. How to avoid saying the same thing. Yeah, well, you do have to say the same thing quite a lot, but you can mix it up, change the wording, change the way you say things slightly, but realistically, you are saying the same thing. The problem doesn't change, does it, between your introduction and your conclusion? So, you know, I think you have to get out of your mind that repeating those things is bad. Okay, it's good. Keep the reader in the loop, keep reminding them. You have a big document, particularly by the final one. You know, it can be anywhere, between 50,000 and 80, 90,000 words. The reader is not going to read it all in one go unless they're super crazy. So, you know, you have to keep reminding. So there's where your repetition comes in, and don't look at it as a bad thing, and get your feedback. You know, when someone's reading your entire chapter, you can say, you know, ask them as part of your when you're asking for feedback, one thing I really want you to check, please, is there too much repetition? Okay, and then see what they say. But yeah, it's really not, repetition is good, all right? But yes, we need to find the balance. Struggle with conclusion and discussion sometimes. I feel like I'm writing the conclusion in my discussion. Yep, I had the same thing. So when you find yourself concluding something in your discussion, pull it out, put it in your conclusion chapter, okay? Because yes, they do go together. As you're writing your discussion and you're thinking, you're going, okay, well, this is my conclusion. So just pull it out, okay? Pop it into the conclusion as a dot point or whatever under one of your subheadings, then come back to your discussion and say, all right, is this enough information? And it should be, you're just discussing the research found this is what it means in the field of this research and previous literature, okay? Again, yes, I know there feels like there's repetition, but there's supposed to be, okay? And don't go too far, don't go too deeply, just plant the seed. And you can say things in your discussion like, this may indicate blah, 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 and then keep it at that, and then pop the rest into the conclusion. Okay, yep, how many people? We've still got a fair few people here. Does anyone want to pop their microphone on and say anything? I assume you can. I know some people are having trouble with their microphones, but yeah, if you want to turn your microphone on and ask a question, that's cool.